May 24th, 2022. Robb Elementary School, Uvalde, Texas. Salvador Ramos, armed with an AR-15 style rifle and hundreds of rounds of ammunition, stormed the campus he once roamed as a student. This wasn't a fantasy of violence he'd concocted in his mind. It was a premeditated reality, a plan brought to life with terrifying precision. At 11:28 a.m., Ramos crashed his grandmother's truck into a ditch near the school. Teachers and students, unaware of what was coming, went about their routines. An officer, who'd heard the initial radio dispatch, drove straight past Ramos. He didn't even look at the real threat sitting in the shadows, waiting for his moment. By 11:33 a.m., the shooter was inside the school, firing round after round through a classroom door, classroom 111, where 11-year-old Jace Carmelo Luavanos would never see the summer sun again. In that moment, death wasn't just a concept, it was real, cruel and violent. Children, only moments before laughing with friends, now lay motionless, their futures stolen in a single act of terror. In the midst of this chaos, a young girl, hiding beneath the desks, managed to dial 911. Her voice trembled, but there was clarity. She whispered into the receiver, her eyes locked on the bloody floor. "Please, send someone. He's shooting. We need help." And still no one came. It took over an hour for law enforcement to breach the classroom and end Ramos's reign of terror. 77 minutes. 77 minutes of silence. Silence punctuated by the sound of faint gunshots. The first responders were there, standing just outside, ready yet frozen. Officers who had trained for this moment, but when faced with it, hesitated. Why? Was it the fear of the unknown, or was it something darker? Moral indecision. The reports from Uvalde's Department of Public Safety were muddled, contradictory. One officer would later describe hearing someone yell, "We've got him contained." But the truth, it seemed, was far more brutal. They didn't have him contained. They had him cornered, but they didn't know what to do next. The chaos outside only deepened with each minute. The 911 calls kept coming. The survivors, children who had witnessed their friends fall to the floor, motionless, remained glued to their hiding spots, clutching to whatever fragment of hope they could hold on to. A teacher, Irma Garcia, died in the classroom, the very space she had once filled with lessons and warmth. Her body, lying cold on the floor, was a chilling reminder of the failure that would haunt Uvalde's law enforcement long after the police had entered. But it wasn't just the children's lives that would be altered forever. Maya Cirillo, one of the survivors, still carries the weight of that day in her memory. Her ability to survive was born of instinct. The instinct to lay still, to feign death, to protect herself with her own classmates' blood. The blood that would be a symbol of both her survival and the failure of the system meant to protect her. The blood on the floor wasn't just a literal trace of what had happened. It was a symbol of the rupture in America's idea of safety. Schools, once seen as sacred spaces, became war zones. The fire alarms that rang out only served as a cruel reminder of the futility of their purpose. The classrooms, meant to be havens of learning, were transformed into tombs. And outside, the officers who should have rushed in to stop the carnage instead stood motionless, unsure. Why? This is the heart of the matter. The moral contradiction that in the face of danger, those entrusted with protection faltered. What does it mean when the very institutions we trust to safeguard our children instead become passive bystanders? We see the fallout in the days after. Local leaders scrambling to piece together an explanation, a justification. The school district police chief, Pedro Arredondo, claimed he didn't consider himself the incident commander. But who then was? Why did it take so long to neutralize the shooter when tactical teams were ready and willing? The investigation revealed further cracks in the narrative. The door to the classroom wasn't even locked, a fact Arredondo would later deny. The truth slowly unraveled. A breakdown in communication, a failure of leadership, an institution fractured beyond repair. The families, the victims, the survivors, all of them are left to pick up the pieces. The community of Uvalde will never be the same. Yet, the true cost lies in the decisions made that day. Decisions that allowed the bloodshed to continue. But here's the question that haunts us all. How could this have happened? The answers. Are they buried in the failures of law enforcement? Or in the culture of fear and hesitation that gripped Uvalde that fateful day? And what happens when a community finds itself locked in the silence of indecision? What if, this time, the silence is louder than the gunfire? The search for answers is far from over. The air was thick with tension. Inside the school hallway, officers crouched behind a wall, listening to the sporadic crack of gunfire from the classrooms ahead. A few moments ago, they'd heard a faint cry, a desperate whisper on the wind. Help. But now, there was nothing. Why weren't they going in? The question echoed in their minds as they stood, paralyzed by indecision. Time, which had never moved so slowly before, was now a cruel mockery of every second that passed. Every second that the shooter, Salvador Ramos, remained inside, and every second that the children and teachers trapped inside with him were left to die. Would they make the move? Or would they wait for the cavalry to arrive? 11:42 a.m. The exact moment when the initial confusion began to unravel. The timeline that would set the stage for countless questions. Law enforcement had arrived, but they were caught in a deadly standoff. A standoff not with the shooter, but with themselves. Officers in the hallway, aware of the horror unfolding within, hesitated. Pedro Arredondo, the chief of the Uvalde School District Police, stood at the front. He and his team had been first on the scene, but instead of charging into the room to confront the gunman, Arredondo called for backup. He communicated the scene as a barricaded subject rather than an active shooter situation. The distinction was subtle, but deadly. By labeling the situation this way, Arredondo delayed the immediate tactical response, ultimately leading to a 77-minute gap between the first law enforcement arrival and the eventual breach. In the meantime, survivors inside the classroom were desperately calling 911. One of the students, barely 10 years old, whispered into the phone, "He's shooting at us. We're going to die." The dispatcher, trying to maintain composure, urged her to stay quiet. But what were they waiting for? The decision to wait wasn't an easy one for the officers. Many of them had children of their own, some of them were parents themselves. But the moment those children, those students, became nothing more than targets in the eyes of the officers outside, the weight of indecision grew unbearable. Officers spoke in hushed tones, doubts swirling. "I don't know if we're going to make it in time," one officer muttered. Another, eyes fixed on the classroom doors, tightened his grip on his weapon. His mind raced. What was the right thing to do? What would happen to the others if we go in? But the officers couldn't move. They couldn't shake the fear that by charging in without the proper backup, they'd be risking not just their lives, but those of everyone inside. And still, the gunshots echoed in the distance. The school's walls, meant to protect and safeguard the children inside, now felt like a prison. Prisoners not of their own making, but of a system that failed them at the worst moment possible. The officers outside, like sentinels, faced the moral crossroads of action versus caution. Should they wait for the perfect response? Trained professionals with armor, more tactical gear? Or should they risk the lives of the children by taking matters into their own hands? The metaphors were impossible to ignore. The walls that divided them were more than just physical. They were moral. A thick, suffocating line between inaction and hope. Minutes passed. Then came the cavalry. A team of U.S. Border Patrol agents arrived. They had the equipment, the experience, the drive. They were ready. But still, they waited. They waited for someone to take command. The question lingered, who was in charge here? As the minutes stretched on, Arredondo was the one to call the shots. He was the incident commander, or so he thought. But now it was unclear whether he understood the magnitude of the situation. Reports from officers suggest that at least 19 law enforcement personnel were gathered outside those classrooms. But instead of rushing in, they were held back. Tactical teams assembled in the hallway as time slipped away. A few officers had already arrived at the school and engaged with Ramos, briefly exchanging gunfire. But they retreated. Why? Were they afraid to confront him head-on? Or was it the chilling truth that each officer knew they could not afford to fail? The longer they waited, the clearer it became. The officers outside knew, deep down, that their hesitation was costing lives. Every minute spent waiting was another child's life at risk. The silence was unbearable. With the Border Patrol agents now in place and their weapons raised, Arredondo finally agreed to breach the door. But there was no rush. Instead of charging forward, they waited. The final line of officers, the very ones who would end this nightmare, stood still in that hallway. It would take just one decision to end the carnage. But who would make it? The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the hallway as the sound of shuffling boots filled the air. Officers, tense and focused, made their way towards the classrooms. The clock ticked louder now, each second, a weight that no one dared acknowledge aloud. In the dim light, a whisper sliced through the oppressive silence. He's still in there. Who could have stopped it? Outside, a community watched with bated breath, praying for action. Inside, the bodies of the fallen remained, still, cold, untouched. The question hung in the air. How could this have happened? It was 12:03 p.m. when the police finally reached the threshold of the classrooms where Salvador Ramos had barricaded himself, and the deadly game of waiting continued. More than 19 law enforcement officers were now present. Some of them experienced tactical agents with Border Patrol and Uvalde PD, while others were local, caught in the spiraling tide of confusion and uncertainty. Yet, still, they stood. At this moment, they could see the door, the one separating them from Ramos and the 19 children he had already killed. The same door that had been there for nearly an hour, a physical barrier to justice. But the hesitation wasn't only about whether to breach. It was deeper. The officers knew that the decision to move would carry irreversible consequences. If they failed, how many more lives would be lost? It wasn't just about entering that room. It was about what would happen once they did. And so they hesitated. Ramos was still alive. And in a building that had already been violated beyond comprehension, the final breach was now a battle of willpower. Inaction had already proven its deadly cost. For every officer standing in the hallway, there was the weight of personal stakes pressing down. An unbearable pressure. A senior officer, his hand gripping his weapon tight, felt the fear seep into his chest. What was the right thing to do? Would charging in have made a difference? For each minute that passed, their hesitation deepened. Some officers tried to convince themselves that this delay was strategic, that waiting for backup would give them the upper hand. But the reality was far harsher. They weren't just waiting for tactical advantage, they were waiting for permission. A new wave of fear washed over them. What if it was too late? And yet, that same hesitation, that same deadly pause, was embedded in their bones. The weight of each step in this journey was being compounded by a crushing doubt. Their training had told them to act quickly, decisively. But none of them had prepared for this. The moment when doing nothing felt as deadly as rushing in without thought. The door in front of them, shiny, cold metal, became a symbol of their failure. It was more than just a physical barrier. It represented the deep divide between what should have been and what was now reality. The door was locked, but metaphorically, they were locked out too. Trapped between duty and fear, between doing what was right and what could be justified later. This door, like the wall between law enforcement and their responsibilities, became the line between heroism and paralysis. The weight of their own decisions stood there with them, unspoken but deafening. The building, the victims, the very air they breathed, the entire scene had transformed. It wasn't just a tragedy in the making anymore. It had become the symbolic reckoning of a failure much larger than any one officer. The line between right and wrong blurred before their eyes. It was 12:17 p.m. when the weight became unbearable. Arredondo, still attempting to manage the scene, ordered that the officers hold their ground. Meanwhile, the situation inside continued to devolve. Another 911 call came in, this time from one of the surviving students. The girl, her voice strained and fearful, begged for help. Her voice, hoarse and frail, carried the weight of the hours she had spent in that classroom. "We're running out of time," one officer whispered, his voice breaking the stillness. They could no longer afford to wait. But there was no move yet. Even as the calls for help mounted, even as their own fears surged, they remained stationary. What was holding them back? Why wasn't this ending? The moment of action, that final breath of life-saving urgency, had been delayed by bureaucratic missteps and a culture of risk aversion. They were all aware of it. At 12:25 p.m., they were finally given the green light, after what felt like hours spent standing by, armed but impotent. With Border Patrol's tactical team now in position, a battering ram was brought forward and the breach was imminent. But in their minds, the lingering question remained. What if it's too late? The door finally gave way. Officers rushed into the classroom, weapons raised. They could hear movement inside. But then, nothing. The heavy silence pressed down on them once again, and they knew, with every fiber of their being, that what lay ahead would change them forever. Was it too late to save the children? As they pushed forward, every step felt like the opening of Pandora's box. There would be no turning back from what they were about to face inside. But still, the one question lingered. Who would face the truth of what had really happened? The heavy hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound that filled the sterile, cold room. No one spoke, couldn't speak, as the truth they'd been avoiding for so long now rippled through the air. Why didn't you act sooner? It was the question that haunted every officer who had stood in the hallway for those endless minutes, and it was the question that echoed louder with each passing second. In that silence, broken only by the harsh, mechanical beeps of a dying clock, something shifted. Could they still make it right? It was 12:50 p.m. when the door finally breached. But the delay, the excruciating time spent waiting in the hallway, was not just a matter of missed opportunities. It was a matter of lives, of children who might still be alive had they been rescued sooner. As the law enforcement officers stormed the classroom, their hearts pounded against their chests, and they moved with the certainty of soldiers sent to fight a war they'd already lost. Ramos was down. The last of his bullets fired into a room already filled with death. And yet, the aftermath was just beginning. The physical battle may have been won, but the war inside each officer was far from over. They filed into the room, stepping over the blood, the broken bodies. They saw the aftermath, the cold, lifeless faces of the children and teachers who had lost everything. And as they did, a sinking realization settled into each officer's chest. Could we have done something sooner? There was no escape from that question. It clung to them like the heavy weight of the gun in their hands, an ever-present reminder that the delay in their actions wasn't just a tactical failure, it was a moral one. Time had bled away, and with it, the chance to change the outcome. For the officers who had waited, the internal struggle was sharp. They questioned everything. In their minds, they replayed the decisions that had led them here. What if I had gone in first? The thought gnawed at them relentlessly. Among them, one officer stood out. His face, drawn with exhaustion and guilt, betrayed the internal battle he had fought throughout the ordeal. He had been one of the first to hear the initial gunshots, to understand the gravity of the situation. Yet, when the decision to wait had been made, he had complied. But now, the weight of his compliance was something he could no longer ignore. Was I part of the problem? In a single glance across the room, he saw the faces of his colleagues, each one haunted by their role in what had happened. They had followed the protocols, adhered to their training, but what had that really meant when it came to saving lives? This wasn't just about tactics anymore. It was about something deeper, darker, a collective moral failure. The realization that their hesitation had cost the lives of innocents broke through with a brutal force. As officers carried the children's bodies out of the room, the air felt heavier with each step. The brutal weight of what they were seeing, feeling, wasn't just physical. It was emotional, psychological, and moral. With every body removed from the scene, the question lingered. Why had this happened? By the time the last of the bodies was taken from the room, the officers were no longer the same people who had entered. The The faces of the victims were now etched into their minds, permanent markers of the truth they couldn't escape. And the waiting? The moments spent hesitating, second-guessing their own decisions? They couldn't outrun that. It followed them into every room, into every conversation. The weight of the inaction now defined them just as much as the rescue efforts they had made. The real battle, the one that would rage on long after the smoke had cleared, was the one inside their own hearts. How would they live with this? As they exited the building, the sound of sirens and chaos still echoing through the streets of Uvalde. One officer lingered by the doorframe. His hand rested on the splintered wood, and in that moment, he wasn't just thinking about what had happened inside. What comes next? The question gnawed at him, deeper than anything before. What would the community think of them? What would the families of the victims say when they found out how long the response had taken? What would they say when they found out that their children had waited, helpless, while law enforcement stood outside, paralyzed by indecision? And as the officer stood there, staring at the broken door, the weight of his guilt threatened to crush him. He had done his job. They had all done their jobs. But now, it was clear. The road to redemption would be long and fraught with moral reckoning. The air was thick, damp with the weight of unresolved grief. The courtroom was a sterile arena, where justice was both sought and denied in equal measure. Inside the walls, the families of the victims waited, eyes fixed forward, but their minds trapped in the past. And there it was, the question that reverberated through every heart in the room. Will this ever be enough? The gavel had already fallen in one sense, but the true reckoning, the one that would define how we, as a society, look at this tragedy, was still ahead. No one had been truly held accountable yet. Could justice ever truly heal these wounds? It had been a year since the massacre at Robb Elementary School. A year of legal wrangling, of courtrooms packed with angry voices, and of bitter reflection for everyone involved. The Texas Rangers had investigated. The Department of Justice had weighed in. And yet, here they were, still struggling to piece together what had gone wrong and why no one had acted sooner. The facts were clear, though. It wasn't just the shooter who was responsible. It was the hesitation that led to countless lives lost in those terrifying minutes. When Salvador Ramos had opened fire, the first responders should have been there, immediately. But they hadn't been. For over an hour, the law enforcement officers had waited in the hallway. They had failed to breach the door, despite knowing that the children and teachers inside were still alive, still waiting for help. Some of them had even called 911, begging for the officers to act, begging for their lives. But nothing had happened. The broken truth, the one no one wanted to speak, was that the officers had failed the victims in their time of need. There was no quick answer for why. No one knew for certain, but everyone who had been there knew the feeling, the ache in their chest when they realized that waiting had been a fatal choice. Inside the courtrooms, the families sat in silence, waiting for the words that would come next. The tension between them and the officers who stood trial was palpable. There was no easy way to address the damage done. The agony of those moments, the helplessness that could never be undone, was woven into every tear that fell, every quiet plea for justice. For one mother, the weight of that inaction was personal. Her child, whose smile once brightened the room, was gone forever because the police had waited too long. It wasn't just the shooting that had stolen her child, it was the decision made in those precious minutes, when the officers had stood back and waited for backup. And as she sat there, the mother asked herself, what kind of world lets this happen? But her grief was only half of it. Anger twisted through her chest. It wasn't just about losing her child. It was about the moral betrayal that had taken place. Inaction had been a form of complicity. And for her, the question remained, who will hold them accountable? The officers who had failed to act were no different than those who had directly caused harm. Inaction was its own form of violence. And for the families, the lack of closure, of accountability, felt like a secondary trauma, a wound that would never heal unless someone, somewhere, stepped forward to say, this was wrong. This could have been prevented. The courtroom was a mirror, reflecting not just the events of that day, but everything that had come afterward, There were no clean hands here. No one was untouched by the horror. As the families looked at the officers, it was clear. The system had failed them, and yet the system was now asking them to trust it. One officer, who had been there that day, sat rigid, his eyes hollow. He had seen the faces of the victims, had heard the calls for help. And now, as he sat in the courtroom, he was forced to confront the consequences of that inaction. The weight of the tragedy hung over him, a constant reminder that this was not just about duty. It was about moral responsibility. The symbol of the broken door from that day, the one the officers had failed to breach, was now a metaphor for everything that was wrong with the response. It was a door that should have been opened, a line that should have been crossed. But it hadn't been, and the guilt that followed was inescapable. The days in court dragged on, each new revelation adding to the heavy burden of what had already been said. But the most damning fact remained. The law enforcement officers had failed to act when they were needed most. The hesitation was not just tactical, it was a failure of humanity. As the case progressed, the family's resolve only hardened. They wanted answers, not just for themselves, but for the other families, for the children who would never grow up, for the teachers who had tried to protect their students with their own bodies. And so, the tension grew. Each new day in court revealed more of the same truth. There was no simple explanation for what happened that day. There was no single moment where the blame could be placed. It wasn't just one officer, one department, one decision. It was a system that had failed, a failure that had cost lives. The defense tried to argue that the police had done their best with limited resources, but it didn't sit well with the families. They had heard the 911 calls, the frantic voices of children asking for help, knowing it was just moments too late. It was too much to bear. The trial reached its final days, but the family's questions remained unanswered. Would the officers involved be held accountable? Or would the system fail them again, allowing the true moral weight of the tragedy to go unrecognized? As the judge prepared to make his final remarks, the families sat in silence, awaiting the conclusion they had longed for. But in the back of their minds, a terrifying thought lingered, one they couldn't shake. What happens if justice is never served?